So, the new show, Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, just premiered, and it's pretty great. I love that instead of just doing an origin for the MCU Spider-Man, the show is instead making some big changes and switching things up to make it its own. Introducing characters like Nico, Minoru, and Lonnie into the cast, as well as new takes on Harry and Norman Osborn. Spider-Man has had a long history of animated series. Ever since 1967, the wall crawler's been portrayed in animation, and for many people, that's resulted in some of the best and most iconic depictions of the character. And with the release of this new show, it's gotten me thinking, what would my dream animated Spider-Man show look like? What ways could we make it unique and stand apart from what came before, while also staying true to what makes the character special? Funny enough, it's actually been over a year since my last dedicated Spider-Man video, and it's kind of been nice to take a break from the character, but I don't know, for some reason I feel compelled to make another one. Like there's this voice in my head that keeps getting louder and louder, and it's telling me to take back what's mine, Spider-Man. Does that happen to anyone else, or is that just me? We all know that Peter Parker isn't really the world's best gift giver, but with Valentine's Day right around the corner and his rotating roster of like 50 girlfriends and also Johnny Storm, what's a guy like him to do? Which is why this video is brought to you by Holzkern. Holzkern makes watches and jewelry for all genders and specializes in products made from natural materials like FSC certified wood, stones, gemstones, and more. The name Holzkern literally means wood core in German. And because of those materials and how every piece is handmade, that means that every product is completely unique and no two pieces are going to be exactly the same, which makes for an even better gift. This watch that I got from them is just gorgeous. It's made out of rose gold with a vegan leather band, and the dial is made out of white nacre. It's become my go-to fancy premium watch for when I want to class it up a little bit. And I also got this necklace for my partner as an early Valentine's Day gift, made out of gold and moonstone. Holzkern offers free express worldwide shipping all the way from Vienna, and if you order by February 7th, it's guaranteed to arrive in time for Valentine's Day. Click the link down in the description to get 15% off your order, plus a free gift bag when you use my code for a limited time. Thanks to Holzkern for sponsoring this video, and thanks to my patrons and my channel members who are able to keep this channel afloat for just $1 a month. This new show has been pretty great so far. I think that deciding to make the whole thing one big what-if story and go against the grain of MCU canon is a huge reason to why it's working so well for me. It reportedly went through a lot of behind-the-scenes revisions, and you can see some of those cracks a little bit. I'm not fully in love with every decision, like having Uncle Ben's death before Peter becomes Spider-Man, but at this point, I don't fucking care anymore. I'm not poking that bear again. You can't drag me back into that fight. And for the most part, you can really tell that showrunner Jeff Trammell and the rest of the team behind it have such a deep and passionate love for the character, and that shines through. My favorite aspects have been with the new supporting cast, like Nico, Minoru, and especially Lonnie, who they're using to showcase some really interesting social commentary. If you don't know, Lonnie is Tombstone in the source material, and it's really interesting to set him up as this quarterback with a heart of gold when we know what will probably become his fate. Especially if they go in the direction that I think they're going, it has the potential to be one of the best Spider-Man stories we've ever seen in adaptation, and that really excites me. The biggest drawback for the show is obviously the animation. Some of the action scenes are pretty fun, especially when the show utilizes the strengths of 3D animation, but as of now, it feels like it's just lacking in budget and some corners were cut by Disney, and it just feels unpolished. And it's a shame too, because the animation studio Polygon Pictures is known for some amazing work, and I'd really hoped that they'd be able to shine here. But aside from that and some very stupid comments from the lead actor that don't even make sense, the show has a lot of promise, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. If you want to hear my full in-depth thoughts on the first couple episodes, that's available exclusively for the amazing and spectacular tiers of my Patreon and channel members. I'm going to be doing more exclusive videos from now on, so stick around for those. This is the first animated Spider-Man show we've gotten since Marvel's Spider-Man ended in 2020. Technically, there was also Spidey and His Amazing Friends, but that was very clearly for a much younger audience. Still can't believe they directly adapted Kraven's Last Hunt though. That might have been a bit too much. And so it got me thinking about what I would do if I were put in Jeff Trammell's position and had a chance to showrun a whole new animated show for the wall crawler. I know what you're thinking. Just bring back Spectacular Spider-Man. I literally see you typing it in the comments right now. Released in 2008, the Spectacular Spider-Man is my favorite Spider-Man. Period. I grew up on reprints of the Lee and Ditko run and DVDs of the 90s animated series, and those are great, but Spectacular was what genuinely and truly made me fall in love with the character. The show was super successful, both in ratings and from critics, but when Disney purchased Marvel in 2009, that included the TV rights to Spider-Man, and since Spectacular was made under Sony, it was canceled prematurely and Ultimate Spider-Man took its place. I've seen a growing resurgence in Ultimate Spider-Man show fans lately, and I'm sorry, that show is just not for me. Before it was canceled, showrunner Greg Weisman had said that there were plans for a third and fourth and even fifth season, including various spin-off movies. We were going to see villains like Carnage and Hobgoblin, Scorpion, and more. And so a potential third season could finally bring those plans to life. Or maybe they could go in a different direction while still keeping true to the core of the show. I think it might be fun to do a bit of a time jump and see the characters in a senior year or college. The show took a lot of inspiration from Ultimate and the original Lee and Ditko run, but it might be fun to see how they could pull from some other eras of the comics. So if tomorrow Disney announced that they were bringing back Spectacular for a third season and gave it that X-Men 97 treatment, I would be ecstatic. But at the same time, I would be a little bit worried. I think just naturally, I'm always a little bit apprehensive about shows getting a revival after so many years, especially something that's as important to me as Spectacular. Sometimes it can work out and be fantastic like with X-Men 97, but other times the expectations can be a bit too high and the reboot taints the rest of the legacy. I think I'm just the kind of person who would rather 2 seasons of great TV that never got completed, as opposed to 2 great seasons and then 2 just okay seasons. If we're talking reboots, another Spider-Man show I think could really use a comeback is the new animated series from 2003 on MTV. That show only got the 1 season, and because it was on MTV, it was able to go a lot more mature with its stories and its themes, but it never really got the spotlight that I think it deserves, in part because of the network and the animation style. But when it hit, that show fucking hit. And I know what else you're probably saying. They should just adapt the comics directly. Okay, this is a whole discourse that's a whole can of worms that's been debated for like decades at this point, and I kind of sit in the middle of it. On one hand, I totally see the appeal of a direct one-to-one adaptation. We've seen it work for things like Invincible or the entire anime industry. Adapting a story beat for beat, making changes here and there when necessary, has its place and is a really great way to showcase the stories in the source material. And so an animated show that takes the Amazing Spider-Man run all the way back to Amazing Fantasy with the Lee and Ditko stuff, and then going chronologically from there with Lee and Romita and McFarlane and JMS and so on, maybe even changing art styles to emulate the different comic artists, that has potential to be super fun and showcase these early stories to people who may not be capable of reading them. Because believe me, I've seen the way some of you talk about the Lee and Ditko run. You did not read those fucking comics. But on the other hand, I also see the value in an adaptation taking liberties and trying something new as opposed to just directly following the source material. It allows for reinvention and creativity with iconic shows like Batman the Animated Series, which was heavily inspired by the comics but didn't follow anything verbatim. And that let them try new things and reinvent characters like Clayface or create whole new characters like Harley Quinn. Superman's flight is something that arguably first appeared in an adaptation with the radio serials. Even Invincible isn't a direct one-to-one adaptation, and the changes that are being made are genuinely a massive improvement over the original source material, which is only possible because of the direct involvement of Robert Kirkman. Not to mention the scale and budget required for a show like that. Replicating someone like McFarlane's style and animation is damn near impossible, and how a lot of comics either haven't aged well or are just plain bad. I think it seems like more of a good idea on paper than it would be in practice. Also, I don't know if I think this should be a 9-year-old's first time seeing Spider-Man, and so instead, I think a good alternative would be a motion comic. I'm a big believer that the comics industry needs to adapt and have their equivalent of audiobooks, either for disabled people who physically can't read them, or for people who just want another way of accessing these stories, or even just something to listen to while reading the actual book. I mean, it's clearly working for the publishing industry in quote-unquote real books, and so a motion comic could be just that. The industry has toyed with it before, like with Watchmen or Astonishing X-Men, but for some reason the companies keep giving up on the idea. But we've just been talking about adaptations or bringing something back that came before, and so how would I go about making my perfect Spider-Man show? How could we take the things that I love about the character and bring them to a TV series without retreading the same ground? The show opens with none other than the Rhino terrorizing New York City. Spider-Man swings in to put a stop to him and they fight. Peter webs him up, throws out some jokes, you know how it goes. And that's when we hear a school bell ring, and Peter is late for class. We cut to a classroom at Midtown High, and Mr. Peter Parker, the new science teacher, barges into the room. Peter Parker as a teacher was first introduced in Amazing Spider-Man number 31 by J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr. from 2001. And it's always been my favorite status quo for the character. It puts Peter in one of the most famously undervalued and underpaid jobs in the world as a public school teacher, and all the stress that comes with that. And for an episodic series, it opens up the doors for so many different opportunities and story engines. I know I speak for a lot of people when I say that I'm kind of sick of Spider-Man being in high school. In the past 20 years, it's just been such an oversaturation in movies and TV shows, especially given how quickly he graduated in the 616 universe and how there's so much more to his stories than that. Ultimate is a different story. That dude died before getting a diploma, but 616 Peter was only in high school for a whopping 28 issues, and we're still trying to milk those 2 years for all it's worth, all while constantly regressing Peter's character to fit it. But I also totally understand the reasoning why we keep going back. The reason so many TV shows are set in high school isn't just because they're trying to market the show to teenagers, but because high school at its core works really well for TV. The characters are young and brash and have messy personal relationships, but unlike college where you're an adult and all have different class schedules, high school forces everybody into the same space every single day, which is just simpler logistically. But also those personal problems get messier. Stories thrive off of conflict, and that conflict just writes itself. And then you throw being Spider-Man into the mix, you know, having to sneak out of class to fight crime and balance that life, and it's no wonder why we keep going back to that status quo. So having Peter as a teacher gives us the best of both worlds. It keeps those high school roots without constantly regressing him back to being a kid and telling the same kind of thing over and over again. And so in these opening scenes, we're introduced to Peter and his life as a teacher. He's in his mid-30s, married with kids, and just started this new job at Midtown, and we meet one of his students, Miles Morales. Okay, this idea isn't really the most original take anymore. It's how I ended my big Spider-Man college trilogy video, and the Spider-Man 2 game did it, but that concept was essentially abandoned after the first mission, which I get. They had their story that they wanted to tell for Peter's character, and getting fired and getting a new job was was part of it. But at the same time, this dynamic is so interesting and has so much potential for long-running stories that I want to see a series genuinely give that an attempt. Honestly, I feel like Miles is basically a given for any modern Spider-Man media at this point, especially an animated show. Not only is he a really great character that I love, but also it's a second Spider-Man to sell toys of. Disney's gotta love that. Frankly, I'm surprised he hasn't had his own series at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if Miles ends up showing up in this new show in some way or another, since they're already straying so far from the MCU canon, and that could be really fun. The show could blend elements of the JMS run, with Peter helping out other students in his class, as well as parts of Renew Your Vows and the new Ultimate run where Peter's married with kids. Peter and Miles don't really team up as much as I like in the source material. They kind of just stick to their own stuff and really only cross over for big events. But Greg Weisman, the showrunner of Spectacular Spider-Man, literally has a team-up comic with Peter and Miles called The Spectacular Spider-Men. Honestly, you could just call the show that, and that could be your season 3 now that I think about it. And so in the pilot episode, we see that Miles is in his very, very early days of being Spider-Man. Meanwhile, Peter is an experienced Spider-Man, but is still trying to figure out teaching. I don't think we need to show Miles' origin specifically, although Miles' origin has been getting more and more complicated as of late. But maybe it's a couple days after he was bitten, and he's going through all the growing pains of getting his powers. Maybe he's still getting used to things, and he's built his own version of a homemade suit. And Peter sees this happening to one of his students, so he steps in to sort of show him the ropes. Or the webs, I guess. For a lot of his publication history, Peter has kind of been a bit of a lone wolf. He teams up with other heroes all the time, like the Fantastic Four and Daredevil and the lot, but it's mostly for events or one-off stories. And aside from Felicia or Kitty in the Ultimate Comics for a bit, he's never really taken on a long-term partner or student and has mostly gone about doing his thing alone. And so it could be interesting if maybe his first episode is him questioning whether or not he should bring Miles into that life or let him fly solo. What will be really fun is if for the first episode, the main villain was the Vulture, and they pulled from Amazing Spider-Man number 63 by Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. from 1968. Most people know the Vulture as Adrian Toomes, played by Oscar-winning actor Michael Keaton and first appearing in Amazing Spider-Man number 2 by Lee and Ditko. Technically, Toomes is the second Vulture. The first was Isidoro Scarlatti, created by Joe Gill and Carl Burgos, who was a villain for the original Human Torch in the 50s, but that doesn't really matter here. Or does it? It doesn't. It doesn't. Toomes was a Vulture for 4 years, but Lee thought that Spider-Man looked too much like a bully beating the shit out of an old man all the time. And so in Amazing Spider-Man number 48 from 1967, he and artist John Romita Sr. had Blackie Drago take up the mantle of Vulture. But they had gotten so many letters from fans saying that they hated this new guy as the Vulture and to bring back the original. Oh damn, I guess Spider-Man fans have always been like that, huh? And so this story, titled Wings in Flight, is about Toomes coming out of hiding and fighting Blackie Drago to take back his mantle. It's one of my favorite classic Spider-Man stories from one of my favorite eras, and I'd love to see it get brought to life in some way. And I think since this show would focus so much on the concept of legacy and these two Spider-Men coexisting together, we could use the villains to be kind of an antithesis to that. So we start with these two guys who are fighting over the title of Vulture to contrast Peter and Miles starting to work together. I really like how the Insomniac games aren't having Miles go by a different name and instead are letting him and Peter stand together both as Spider-Man. I see people say all the time that having two Spider-Men running around at the same time is confusing, but in practice it really isn't. You just call them by, and this is crazy, hear me out on this, by their names. You know, the same thing you do when there's two Green Lanterns or two Flashes in the same room. I think we're at the point culturally where they can both just be called the same thing instead of trying to force Kid Arachnid or something like that. Maybe the pilot episode ends with Peter setting up the photography club for him and Miles to use the school as kind of like a base of operations. And once you set that groundwork in the status quo, the episodes kind of just write themselves. And so when talking about the future of the show, there's a lot of different ways you could go. Each episode could follow Miles doing the high school stuff with Peter teaching him all the tricks that he had to learn on his own, all while fighting some villain of the week. I love the thought of making Peter this kind of Barry Allen figure, who's this dorky scientist at the head of the family. The show doesn't have to be your everyday villain of the week type of formula either. Part of the reason Spectacular did so well is because those episodic one-off stories fed into greater mysteries and longer running conflicts that built more and more. As for the big bad, as much as I love me some Green Goblin or Venom, and they would work really well for the legacy villain angle, I'd rather we see some characters that haven't really been given a proper treatment. Lesser knowns that can be genuinely scary and amazing villains if given the right spotlight, sort of like Spot in Across the Spider-Verse. I'm telling you, I really think that Big Wheel has potential to be a really compelling villain and not just a joke. Like, that's not even a bit. It'll take one good writer and we'll have another A-lister, I promise. As for introducing other Spider people into the mix, I'd personally prefer to keep things simple with just Peter and Miles. The occasional 2099 or a Ben Reilly could be fun for an episode or two, and Gwen could fit really well into the cast like this, but as much as I love the Spider-Gwen character, especially that initial run by Jason Latour and Robbie Rodriguez from 2015, I do think she's kind of been in everything lately, and it might be best to give that character some space. One thing that I think needs to be a big priority when it comes to a Spider-Man show is the animation and the visuals. Both Spectacular Spider-Man and even Ultimate's animation was pretty fantastic, and the 2003 MTV show was breaking new ground when it came to 3D animation. But the 2017 Marvel Spider-Man show was just plain ugly, which isn't the blame of the animators themselves, but they just didn't have the time or the budget that they needed. And this isn't just a Marvel or a Spider-Man thing, but the whole animation industry. Animation is expensive and requires time and budget. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that for those reasons, animated shows are getting kind of the short end of the stick, and that's a shame. Especially when there's so many amazing fan animations, and the Spider-Verse movies are literally redefining the animation industry. Even Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man seems to have this issue. From what I've heard, early during development, it was originally going to be a hand-drawn 2D show, which is why the concept art is in this really cool Ditko-esque style by Leo Romero. But allegedly, because of budgetary restrictions, they had to pivot to 3D with a cel-shaded art style and salvage what they had to try to emulate the 2D style. But because it's trying to do both, it doesn't utilize the strengths of either. And so I would want a show like this to either lean fully into the 2D style, either have it hand-drawn, or use the same practices as the new Fairly OddParents cartoon, which emulates the 2D much better, or just go all in on the 3D. They were intentionally trying not to be too similar to the Spider-Verse movies in that style, which I understand, but also I say fuck it. Those movies are gorgeous and they awoke an entire new style of animation that everybody's copying, so let's lean into that. But as of late, especially in the TV space, I feel like companies have been cutting more and more corners with animation for kid shows. This medium has been sidelined purely to save a buck, and that's really frustrating. For a lot of people, animation was their first exposure to these characters, either with the 90s Spider-Man or the DCAU or Young Justice or even Spectacular. And so it's really exciting that we finally have Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man in animation again. While Caped Crusader is definitely for a more mature audience, my adventure with Superman and Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man could very well be a new generation's first and favorite version of the characters, especially kids who deserve to have good art to engage with instead of corporate slop just meant to plop them in front of the TV and distract them all day. Stories that explore not only what makes these characters great, but also introduce themes and important social issues to teach them morality and be a role model for them. It's part of why the woke argument is always so stupid. These characters in these shows have always been woke. Nothing changed. It's just you were a kid and you never noticed. And this constant culture war bullshit gives studios an excuse to sanitize these stories and cut funding for kids animation. And so I'm hoping that with the success of Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, Marvel is able to realize that this medium and these types of stories do matter. Because while it might not be perfect, it's not my dream show and it's not Spectacular Season 3, it doesn't have to be. At the very least, it's a quality animated Spider-Man show that's being made by a team of people who so clearly love the character and have a passion for his stories. And in that, Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is following in the footsteps that came before it. Seriously though, what the fuck was that guy talking about? But what would you want from your dream Spider-Man show, and what are your thoughts on this new show so far? Special thanks to Elijah Wakefield, Alto the Sting, Ans, Aaron Peterson, Awesome, Axu, Cabbage Boy, Cassidy, Calvin Brown, Caroline Brenneman, Chicken McDoofus, Dan, Danny Boy, David Husari, Eden Kenna, Egan McFarlane, Evan Bowers, Fastest Man Dead, Finn Yates, Gavin, Hannah C, Harper Sires, Howard Bell, If You Know You Know, Iron Ninja, Jake Selig, Kai Dud, Ken, Leo Stringer, Melody Dreamer, Men Talk the Mind Taker, Glass Bear Productions, Morpy, Mr. Game 959, Popcorn Eater 123, Raptor 77, Rocco Awad, Rylan Archuleta, Sean Mansington, Spectacular Clyde, Squid Livers, Tafari Tafari, TDW Fan, Theo Crouch, Tim Neufeld, Tom 14, Trenton Cole, Troy Spy Razors Lame, and Yush Kapoor for being spectacular families on my Patreon. This has been Troy Boy 17. Be responsible, and I'll see you around.